Oh, all right, all right, all right. Here's your next set of notes. This should be for Wednesday, April 29th. I think about what month it was. Man, it's all running together. So, anyways, hopefully you guys are doing all right. You turned in your essays yesterday. What I would prepare for is to make sure that my vocabulary is up to snuff. Katie Sizemore asked yesterday where that could be found, and I said week 5. If you look on week 5, it says your new vocabulary words, and there should be a link there on Quizlet so that you can find your vocabulary words. So today, hopefully you've read up on your stuff. We're still in the Industrial Revolution, but we're going to kind of pause that for a second and kind of finish what we talked about the other day with slaves in the United States and reasoning why you have it, what they could do, other types of restrictions. Yeah, so anyway, so let's hit the set of notes here. Let me plug this thing in. Open Goopy slides. Let's see who's messaging me. All right, here we go somewhere. Get out of my way. No. Okay, there we go. All right, still recording. Sorry, it took forever. Okay, so we talked about slavery the other day, about how much it had grown. It had grown from 700,000 slaves in 1790 to 4 million slaves in 1860. So we're going to look a little bit here at the free African Americans because you did have a few Southern African Americans who were free, again, in the South, in the slave South, 6% of 4 million. So it's a decent amount because 4 million is a big number, and I'm not good at the math to figure out what the percentage is. But bottom line, there were very few. If you look at the flip side, 94% of them were slaves. So you did have some free slaves down in the South, free slaves, that doesn't make sense, free African Americans in the South, but it's very similar to what it was in the northern region for that time being, is that they were free, but they could not attend public schools. So a lot of times they educated themselves, and this kind of Frontier House is mentioning this because the mixed race family is going to have to talk about this in the assumption that they would have kids out there, you know, if it was imagining it was real life, how accepted it would be. Would their kids be able to go to school? Would they have to homeschool them themselves? But for most of the places, they could not attend public school, so they would have that themselves. They only held menial or low jobs, and that's going to be in the North as well, that you do not have many jobs that you're going to give to African Americans, whether they are free or slave. So I did not mean to flip back. They also could not vote, they could not serve on juries, and they were discouraged from traveling. So no voting rights, you know, that's not going to change until 1865. No serving on juries, again, juries for trials, and then they were discouraged from traveling. Think about why they would be discouraged from traveling. That one's pretty easy because there's slave catchers everywhere. And these slave catchers, their job is exactly what it sounds like, is that they're catching slaves. And what they might do is they might kidnap free African Americans and sell them into slavery. Now, if you want to see a really good movie that talks about this, or read the book is pretty good too. It's called 12 Years a Slave. And it is the autobiography of an African American who was in, I want to say, Boston. I read it a little while ago, but was in Boston, and there were some slave catchers up there, and they just jumped him, kidnapped him, put him on a boat, actually, and took him down to the South. And so he was a slave for 12 years, even though he was a free black man in the North. And so it talks about his trials as a slave and his method of escaping, which had to do with getting a hold of a friend of his from the North to come down, and it took 12 years for them to do this, to come down and prove that he was actually a free man. And so it's a very interesting story, very graphic too, so just be cautioned to watch it, but you know, from the perspective of somebody who was there, again, it's called 12 Years a Slave. So other restrictions that they had and laws on slavery, because it wasn't the same everywhere, and you say, well, what could they do to really hold them in place? Well, you have different images like this that I'll have in this PowerPoint of advertisements or signs that are for getting slaves who might have escaped. And this one says, my mulatto boy, George, curly hair, dark coat. and I will give $400 for him alive. Now, this is from Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a book by Harriet Beecher Stowe that we'll talk about later. But, you know, you see these pictures, you see these posters, you know, it really could be anybody. Not a whole lot of description as they put on these. So here's where slave catchers is going to have this and say, all right, looks like George to me. So I'm going to take him back. And, you know, even if he's not this person's slave, I can probably sell him to somebody else. So you had slave codes at the time period. Slave codes, black codes, going to be interchangeable. But a code is a law, not like a secret message. So please don't put that on the test. It's not secret messages, the Underground Railroad. That's not where we're at yet. But these were laws that controlled slave lives and that weren't necessarily written down. Now, some of them could be. And here's another example of Tom. 30 years of age, 5'6" or 7 inches, dark color, having a chest, several his jaw teeth out, whip marks along his back. Again, that really could be anybody. So it's not too descriptive. So that way they could get a slave regardless back. So in the court system, the Kentucky court actually said in a court case, a slave is not treated as a person, but as a thing. Imagine that this is you. Imagine that a court in the United States today doesn't say you're a person, they just say you're a thing, you're a property, you're basically an animal or even less than an animal. And that was a perspective that a lot of places, even in terms of law, had these feelings towards African Americans. Oftentimes they're separated from family members. If you were a slave, you did not have to stay. There's no law that you would have to stay with your family. If you had a child, if you were a slave couple, that child could be sold into slavery. They did not have to keep that slave with the family. So again, think of how problematic that's going to be and how you would not want that to be the case. And I'm trying to think of a good example of a movie where that happened. There's one called Harriet. Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Tubman's movie that just came out last year, and that was pretty good too. That talks about her being the Moses. Black Moses is what they called her because she was able to bring so many people up from the South. And she even had a bounty on her head too, but her family was separated during that time period too. Slaves were often beaten just short of death. Showed you this picture. Not to get super graphic, but you know, it's property. It's like if you have an animal that needs discipline, but you don't want to kill it because you're going to have to buy a new one. Same thing in this case. You might beat them as an example or as a punishment. And in some cases, you might actually kill them. But the preferred method is not beating them to death because that is your property. And if you lose one, then you have to replace another slave with another slave. So they were kept alive. They were seen as property. And if you're thinking about it in terms of like animals, again, which I don't, but using examples what the South thought, that if you paired a male and a female together, then nature takes its course perhaps, and then you can kind of have your own slave. I'm trying to think of a good way to put it, but basically they're going to breed and then you won't have to buy any because you have so many slaves. And again, if they had a child, then you could sell that child off. You wouldn't have to keep it with the family. But again, they're seen as property. In 1808, slaves can no longer be sent to the United States. This is called the Act Prohibiting the Importation of Slaves of 1887. Now, this is all in good, great, if it was actually abided by. So do you really think from 1808 through 1865, the end of the Civil War, that no slaves were brought in? Not so much. But this was put into place. But how enforced is it actually, especially if the boats are going towards the south? Probably not so much. So resistance, what could they do? And we've talked about this before in class. From earlier note sets. You could work slowly, you could pretend to not understand. A lot of slaves spoke a different language, but as time progressed, they would learn English, at least basic words, and people just play dumb. You might actually do that with your parents when they tell you to clean your room or do chores and say, oh, I didn't hear you, I didn't know what you say. At least my own kids do that too. But anyways, that's their own method of resisting. You could break equipment, you could flee to the north, and soon we'll talk about the Underground Railroad. It really isn't established yet, but you could try. But the negative here is you get caught breaking equipment, playing dumb, you could probably be punished. If you run to the north, you're probably looking at capture and then getting punished again. So it's that strange and strange land mentality that you're in a place that you don't know how to get out of. What do you do? uh, the best thing you can actually do is just try to survive for as long as you can. Now, I did put this picture up here of dancing and songs, and that is something that slaves were known for uh, for their songs. And, if you do a history of music, you could look into the early origins of blues and jazz would actually come from your early African-American music, even gospel coming from it too, especially if they're Christian and singing to God in their own fashion. There is Nat Turner's Revolt in 1831. I did mention this in class, so we're still in there. There is a book's called Fires of Jubilee, and I'm trying to think of what the Nat Turner movie is called. That came out a couple years ago. I didn't think it was fantastic. I think it could have been a little more detailed in terms of what happened. But Nat Turner was a slave who was told by God in a dream to go and kill whites. Now, later on, we'll talk about a guy named John Brown who almost has the same dream to help slaves and to get rid of slavery all throughout the South. And even last year we talked, and God told him that. And last year we talked about Joan of Arc, who she was told by God to help the French people defeat the English. And well, in none of those three examples did it work out for that person who had that voice of God, but it still could be a good thing. So he's told to go and kill whites, and they do. He ends up getting a slave army, ends up killing a slave master, escaping, get a slave army, and end up killing 60 men, white men, women, and children all throughout South Carolina. But here's the problem. It could be used as a motivational factor for slaves or abolitionists and to rally around Nat Turner and say, yes, Nat, good job. Let's just keep on doing this. And it could strike fear into the heart of slave owners, but the problem is it didn't. It actually went the other direction. So that they had this massacre in Virginia. That was this in South Carolina. But in Virginia, killing 60 people, all these different plantations, the problem is that the whites go the other direction. Instead of being afraid of more rebellions, they end up executing more African Americans. So imagine if you have a slave that you think might potentially revolt or rebel or try to run away, you're going to use that slave as an example and possibly kill them so that the other slaves would end up following the directions and the rules and not doing their own thing, I suppose. So could have been a great rallying point for African Americans, ends up going the other direction because the Southerners are saying, okay, maybe we need to punish them much harder and much more severe, and they actually do. Another restriction that comes into play are rules of these new states coming in. Sorry, drink time. So Missouri, which is a southern state, it's just off to the left, west of Ohio for a little bit. And compromise, meaning that you have two groups that agree to some kind of agreement, That's good sense, I guess. But anyway, so you have this Missouri Compromise, and this takes place in 1819. So you look at this little mappy map here. Here's Ohio already in here, unorganized territory. And here comes Missouri, that is right at this compromise line, which is where you're supposed to, not have slaves, but I guess that doesn't work out. So Missouri wants to come in. So at the time in 1819, you have 11 free states, you have 11 slave states. So what that does is, remember, it gives you a balance of power in the Senate. Since every state has the same amount of senators, in Senate, it's balanced. So if Missouri comes in, it's going to uproot that balance and give more sway towards the slave states. So Missouri wants to enter the Union as a slave state. That map keeps coming up 3 times. So therefore, you have to keep that balance. Maine, backing it up here, Maine is going to come in as a free state. So what you do is you have that balance. It keeps the balance in Senate, 22 free, 22 slave. There's no way that you're going to, on either side, have a slave state or a free state come in without another state balancing off in Senate. It just wouldn't get approved. So it does. So slave owners also, one more thing it's added in the Missouri Compromise, it's kind of like you have today, if you know anything about how Senate and House of Representatives work, is anytime they pass some kind of a bill, usually they tack on these other little things that sometimes may not be seen by other people because they don't read the whole bill. But in this case, they add in slave owners could chase slaves into free states. That now is legal to do that. They could, by legal authority, federal government, chase slaves in the free states. So if slaves escaped to Ohio, Southern slave catchers and owners can end up chasing these people in there. Obviously, this is going to appease the South, but the North is pretty angry because they feel that Congress is allowing, through this Missouri Compromise, the spread of slavery. First of all, by allowing Missouri to come in as a slave state, and then secondly, to allow these southern states to come in with their rules into like Ohio, which does not have slavery, and go and capture that person even though they're in a free territory. So this is going to be very controversial between the states. It will actually be a pressing issue as we muddle our way towards the Civil War. So the North is very angry with this, and obviously on the southern side, they would be pretty happy because of these things, but at the same time, they don't like that the federal government is telling them exactly what they should be doing in terms of slave laws. So we're going to talk about something called popular sovereignty, in the ideas that states should have their own say on things. We talked about this in class, how some states have death penalty, marijuana laws, gay rights, speed limit, even that one too, that they're allowed to determine those things. And part of the reason why we have that is because of issues at this time period with the federal government putting their foot in the way of everybody who wants to have slavery or no slavery, and they're passing nationally. And so obviously the South will be happy with this for the most part, but it's that idea that Congress still keeps playing puppet master over them and telling them what they can and cannot do in their own state. So that's important to talk about because we're going to start talking about some reforms in different fashion, and we're going to start with alcohol, prisons, education, and then we're going to talk about the abolitionist movement, which is its own form of reform as well. So make sure that you tackle your questions. Make sure that you're all the way through this video and that you have all of your points done, because people are forgetting to do that. So anyways, until next time, I don't know what to say, so see ya.